It's in the silence that your discernment grows. That's where God begins to speak in the still small whisper. It's where he begins to download instructions, healing, and vision for your next move. But if you're always busy talking, always trying to prove something, always needing to be right, you miss it. You miss the direction because you're distracted by noise, both outside and inside. Sometimes your silence is what activates heaven. There's a kind of stillness that signals to God, I'm ready for you to take over. When you stop trying to manipulate outcomes and start trusting divine order, you give God permission to show you what he had planned all along. And trust me, God doesn't need your defense. He needs your obedience. He doesn't need your rage. He needs your reverence. Because your silence, when led by the Spirit, is louder than any speech you could give. When Jesus stood before Pilate, he didn't say a word. When he was accused falsely, he didn't clap back. He stood there with divine authority, wrapped in divine restraint. And in doing so, he taught us that just because you're quiet doesn't mean you're defeated. Sometimes it means you're above it. Sometimes it means you're so in tune with your Father's plan that you're willing to be misunderstood for a moment, knowing that vindication is coming in the morning. There's power in that kind of quiet. The kind of quiet that says, I've cried, but I'm not crushed. I've been hit, but I'm still holy. I've been silenced, but it's not punishment, it's positioning. God is hiding you in plain sight. He's using your silence to protect you, to elevate you, to set the stage for something greater. But you have to be willing to endure the discomfort of not being seen or heard right now. Because when it's your season to speak, when it's your time to shine, you won't have to force it. God will open the door and no man will be able to shut it. So yes, your silence is a weapon, not one that wounds others, but one that wars in the spirit. It tears down strongholds. It confuses the enemy. It anchors your soul. Because when the world expects noise, your silence is disruptive. When the devil expects drama, your silence is defiant. And when your old self expects you to react, your silence becomes your testimony. That's why you have to be intent. You have to ask God, is this my battle or is this my silence? Because if it's your silence, baby, don't you dare say a word. Let them talk. Let them speculate. Let them try to figure out how you're still standing. Because they don't know the God who fights for you in silence. They don't know the angels that have been dispatched on your behalf. They don't know that every time you chose not to respond, you were building altars in heaven. So hold your peace. Guard your tongue and let your silence speak volumes about the God you serve. Not every battle needs your voice. Some just need your stillness. It's one thing to be wronged. It's another thing to feel like nobody saw it happen. That somehow the pain you experienced went unnoticed, unacknowledged, unresolved. You start asking questions in the secret place. God, did you see what they did? Did you hear what they said? Did you notice how they twisted my intentions, used my kindness, lied on me, left me, and never looked back? It's easy in those moments to want to take control, to want to clear your name, prove your heart, demand justice. But what if I told you that God can vindicate you in ways your voice never could? You see, when you vindicate yourself, you're limited to your view, your resources, your energy. But when God vindicates you, he reaches into realms you can't touch. He speaks into rooms you'll never enter. He softens hearts you thought were hardened forever. There is no one more equipped, more thorough, more strategic, more patient in vindication than your God. And the best part, he does it without compromising your character. He does it without you having to betray your peace or jeopardize your progress. We've all had moments where we wanted to go off, let's be honest. You wanted to send the paragraph. You wanted to expose the truth. You wanted to shout what really happened so people could finally see you weren't the villain. You weren't the liar. You weren't the problem. But if you've walked with God long enough, you start to realize silence doesn't mean surrender. Silence is often the seat of vindication. Because when you stop fighting to be seen, you give God room to reveal you. And when God reveals you, he does it in a way that leaves no doubt it was him. Sometimes God will allow you to be misunderstood on purpose. Not because he's punishing you, but because he's preparing a stage, a divine setup that requires a moment of obscurity before your unveiling. There are moments when God will let them mock you, label you, leave you just so he can raise you up in front of the same people who thought you were finished. But here's the challenge. You have to be quiet long enough for him to finish writing the story. The thing about God's vindication is that it often looks different than ours. We want an apology. We want public correction. We want receipts and recognition. But God is not in the business of shallow victories. He goes deeper. He doesn't just vindicate your name. He vindicates your purpose. He doesn't just restore your image. He restores your identity. He doesn't just silence the enemy. He elevates you in spite of him. And let me tell you something. When God vindicates, it's undeniable. It's not petty. It's not performance. It's prophetic. He starts opening doors no man can shut. He starts blessing you in ways that your enemies can't explain. He starts giving you peace in situations where you should have lost your mind. That's vindication. It's not just about proving you right. It's about proving he's God. It's about showing that obedience is never in vain, that silence isn't weakness, that restraint is power. And you need to know this too. Sometimes God vindicates you in private first. Before the platform, before the restoration, before the full circle moment, he starts healing the places in you that were broken by their betrayal. That healing is part of the vindication, that growth, that strength, that clarity you gain in the quiet seasons. That's him working. That's him fighting for you in ways you can't see. That's him saying, daughter, I saw it. I was there. I kept record. And I'm not just going to fix the surface. I'm going to redeem the whole thing. Some of us want public vindication, but God wants to give you eternal vindication. Vindication that lasts longer than the applause. Vindication that changes the course of your life. Vindication that sets you up for a purpose so big your past doesn't even feel like the same lifetime. And you only get there when you stop trying to write your own ending and let God be the author. Remember Joseph? Lied on, thrown in a pit, sold by his own brothers, imprisoned for a crime he didn't commit, forgotten, overlooked, but vindicated by God. And not just vindicated, elevated, appointed, positioned, promoted. The same brothers who betrayed him had to come back and receive provision from the very hand they tried to cut off. But Joseph didn't get there by fighting back. He got there by trusting that every injustice was still under divine jurisdiction, that God saw, that God knew, that God would handle it. And he did. Because when God vindicates, he brings justice with a side of destiny. He doesn't just make things right, he makes things new. But you've got to let him. You've got to resist the urge to insert yourself into situations that were never yours to fix. You've got to lay down the need to be understood and pick up the posture of surrender, because surrender is where the supernatural steps in. I know it's hard. I know silence feels like defeat when your heart is crying for justice, but God is not ignoring you. He's positioning you. And sometimes vindication looks like peace that makes no sense. Sometimes it looks like elevation that doesn't match your resume. Sometimes it looks like joy in the place where grief used to live. That's how God moves. He doesn't need to announce it. He just manifests it. When they said you'd never bounce back, and then he raised you when they tried to ruin your reputation, and then he gave you influence. When they shut the door, and then he built you a whole new house. That's vindication. Not because you fought harder, but because you trusted deeper. Because you didn't let bitterness take root. Because you stayed low and let him lift you. Let them talk. Let them assume. Let them draw their conclusions. You don't have to prove your innocence in a court where the judge has already ruled in your favor. The verdict is in. You are chosen, you are covered, you are seen, and heaven is already working on your behalf. Every tear you cried was documented. Every injustice you suffered was recorded. And there's a vindication coming that will make sense of the silence. So don't grow weary. Don't break character. Don't lower your standards trying to meet them at their level. You've been called to higher. And part of that calling means trusting that God is a better defender than your pride will ever be. He doesn't need your anger. He needs your alignment. He doesn't need your rage. He needs your release. Let it go. Let him in. Let him work, because when he does, it won't just be about proving them wrong. It'll be about proving that you were right to trust him all along. There are some blessings you can't carry until your mouth learns how to be quiet. Not because your voice isn't powerful, not because your words don't matter, but because divine timing is delicate, and an undisciplined tongue can destroy what God is trying to build. You've been asking God to move, to open doors, to shift the atmosphere, and he's ready. But first, he's waiting on your mouth to line up with his will. Sometimes your miracle is in motion, but your mouth keeps interrupting it. We live in a culture that celebrates the instant, that says if you've got it, post it. If you feel it, say it. If you want it, go get it. But heaven operates on a different clock. God doesn't just release blessings, he releases them in appointed seasons. And when the appointed time comes, the enemy's strategy won't be to take your gift. It'll be to tempt your tongue, to get you to speak too soon, to post before the promise is protected, to confess fear instead of faith. That's why divine timing requires more than patience. It requires discipline in what you say, when you say it, and how you say it. There are things God has whispered to you in the dark that are not yet ready to be spoken in the light. There are dreams forming in your womb that don't need public validation to grow. They need privacy, sacredness, silence. And that silence isn't punishment, it's protection. Because words have weight, words create, words expose. And if you speak something too soon, you risk putting it in the hands of people who aren't ready to honor it, or worse, people who are assigned to sabotage it. Some of us are frustrated because what we expected to bloom has not yet budded, but we forget that part of blooming is not being seen for a season. Seeds don't talk while they're growing. They stay hidden, they stay buried, and yet transformation is happening under the surface. Roots are digging deep, structure is being formed. And if you interrupt that process with noise, with oversharing, with speaking out of turn, you may delay what God already appointed. Discipline doesn't just show up in your actions. It shows up in your conversation. It shows up in the moments where your flesh wants to react, but your spirit says, wait. It shows up when you know something, but choose not to speak it. Because wisdom tells you that not every truth needs to be told just yet. There is such a thing as timing being just as holy as truth. If the truth is spoken at the wrong time, it can become a weapon instead of a witness. There are doors you're praying for that will require a silenced mouth to open. God doesn't want to just bless you. He wants to know he can trust you with the blessing. Can he trust you to carry vision without announcing it too soon? Can he trust you to sit on a word without needing to validate it by telling people who don't understand its depth? Because discipline in your tongue is the training ground for elevation in your life. Even Jesus didn't speak out of season. When the enemy tempted him in the wilderness, he didn't argue. He responded with the word. When he healed certain people, he told them not to tell anyone because the time had not yet come. And when he stood before Pilate, accused and betrayed, he kept silent because he knew his vindication wasn't in proving a point, but in fulfilling a purpose. His tongue was under divine authority, and because of that, his timing was never off. But we get in trouble when we let our mouths run ahead of our maturity. We say things we're not ready to live. We speak out of pain instead of purpose. We share out of insecurity instead of intimacy with God. And then we wonder why things feel delayed. God isn't denying you, he's developing you. He's trying to teach you how to hold a word before you're trusted to release it. He's teaching you the language of restraint. You can't talk destiny with everyone. You can't talk deliverance with people still comfortable in. You've been carrying battles in your spirit that were never meant to be fought with your mouth. Some of us are tired because we keep trying to win spiritual wars with physical weapons. We keep posting, proving, persuading when God's been saying all along, be still, stay silent, let me handle it. This is not your fight, daughter. This is not your war. There are moments when God is calling you into a sacred silence, not because you're weak, but because your silence is your strength. Because your quiet obedience is the loudest declaration of your trust. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or tried to clear your name in rooms where they were committed to misunderstanding you, this sermon is for you today. I came to tell somebody there's a version of you that only emerges when you quit talking and let God do the talking for you. Your silence is a weapon of spiritual warfare. That sounds counterintuitive, doesn't it? In a world that glorifies speaking out, clapping back, defending yourself, improving your worth, being quiet feels unnatural. It feels like you're giving up ground, when in fact silence, when led by the Spirit, is you taking ground in the unseen. There are some victories you can only win when you choose not to fight with flesh and blood, but instead stand still and let God war for you. You see, silence in the kingdom of God is not the absence of power. It is the presence of trust. It is you saying, God, I don't need to retaliate. I don't need to explain. I don't need to control the narrative. I trust you to do what only you can do. That level of trust doesn't come easy. It comes from being broken in private, from crying in cars and wiping your tears before you walk into work like nothing happened. It comes from learning the hard way that sometimes the most powerful thing you can say is nothing at all. I know what it feels like to want to scream, to want to tell your side of the story, to want to confront the people who betrayed you, to correct the lies, to clap back in a way that would shut the whole thing down. But let me tell you this. There is a version of you that emerges only when you choose silence. Not silence rooted in fear or avoidance, but silence rooted in faith. That silence is not passive, it is active spiritual warfare. You are choosing to let the Lord fight for you, and baby, He never loses. We're not talking about ignoring injustice or pretending like things don't hurt. We're talking about discerning the difference between when God is calling you to speak and when He's calling you to shut your mouth and let Him move. There's a wisdom in silence that forces the enemy to exhaust himself trying to provoke a reaction. The devil hates silence because it means he no longer has control over your response. You're not giving him ammunition. You're not feeding the fire. You're not validating the drama. You are standing still with a confidence that says, I know who I am and I know whose I am. You don't need to curse what God has already decided to curse. You don't need to fight what God has already decided to defeat. If the Red Sea didn't need a sword to part, what makes you think your battle requires your voice? There are some moments when you have to realize that the silence is sacred. It's the silence of trust. It's the silence of surrender. It's the silence that says, I could speak, but I choose to listen. I choose to wait. I choose to let the Holy Spirit intercede on my behalf with groanings too deep for words. Some of us are losing battles we were never supposed to fight because we keep opening our mouths. We talk ourselves into anxiety. We defend ourselves into depression. We argue ourselves into isolation. But silence brings peace. Silence brings clarity. Silence makes space for divine instruction. You can't hear what God is trying to say when your spirit is cluttered with retaliation. And let's be real, some of us learned this the hard way. We've said things out of pain we couldn't take back. We've made declarations from our trauma instead of our healing. But The beautiful thing about God is that even in our mess, he still gives us another chance to choose better. He still calls us to a higher place, a place where silence becomes not just a posture, but a strategy. Not just a reaction, but a revelation back to defend himself. But many times David chose silence and patience. He refused to harm Saul because he trusted God to deliver him in his time. David's silence was a powerful act of faith that allowed God's power to work on his behalf. God protected him, provided for him, and ultimately raised him to the throne. Speaking less also allows your faith to grow. When you resist the urge to talk, to vent, or to complain, you develop a deeper dependence on God. You learn to listen more, to pray more, and to wait more. That posture invites God's power into your life in a way that words sometimes can't. It creates an environment where miracles can happen because you're not trying to control the outcome. You're surrendering to God's will. In our culture today, there's so much pressure to have an opinion, to respond quickly, and to be heard. Social media has amplified this, making it easy to jump into every conversation or conflict. Not only Christ, but God calls us to a higher standard, a standard of faith and trust. When you speak less, you resist the pressure of the world and align yourself with God's kingdom. You choose peace over panic, wisdom over worry, and power over pride. Sometimes God's power works in silence. Sometimes the breakthrough you need isn't in what you say, but in what you don't say. Sometimes the greatest move of God in your life comes when you stop talking and start trusting. When you speak less, you're not stepping back. You're stepping up into a deeper level of spiritual authority. You're declaring that God's power is bigger than your problems, stronger than your enemies, and greater than your circumstances. And there's freedom in that. Freedom from the need to control every situation. Freedom from the burden of always having to explain yourself. Freedom from the anxiety of not being heard. When you allow God's power to work more, you let go of the need to fix everything and trust that God is fixing it for you. So if you're struggling with knowing when to speak and when to be silent, remember this: speaking less is not about being weak. It's about being wise. It's about making room for God's power to move unhindered. It's about trusting that God's plan is bigger than your voice. And when you do that, you'll find that God's power doesn't just work more, it works miracles. In a world that moves at lightning speed, patience feels like a lost art. We live in an age of instant gratification where waiting is often seen as weakness or failure. But the truth is, silence cultivates patience in a way that rushing never can. When you choose to stay silent, especially in moments of uncertainty, hurt, or injustice, you are actually training your spirit to endure. You are developing a spiritual muscle that will carry you through seasons of waiting, disappointments, and growth. Patience is not passive. It's not sitting idly by, hoping things will get better on their own. Patience is active faith. It's trust that God's timing is perfect, even when it doesn't match your own. And silence is the soil where patience grows. When you stop speaking to defend yourself, to demand answers, or to push for your way, you create the space to wait quietly on God. That waiting is the birthplace of endurance, resilience, and spiritual maturity. Many times impatience comes from fear. Fear that God has forgotten you. Fear that your situation will never change. Fear that the delay means you have been forsaken. But silence quiets those fears because it shifts your focus from your circumstances to God's character. In silence, you remember who God is: faithful, loving, sovereign. You remind yourself that He is working behind the scenes, even when you can't see it. That reminder fuels your patience and strengthens your endurance. When you cultivate patience through silence, you also protect your heart from bitterness. Bitterness often grows when we react quickly, when we speak out of hurt or anger, or when we let disappointment fester. But silence is a guard. It shields your heart from bitterness and helps you process pain in a way that honors God and preserves your peace. Your silence becomes an act of submission, saying, I will trust you, Lord, even when it's hard. I will wait on you without complaint. There's a story in the Bible about Joseph, who was sold into slavery, falsely accused and imprisoned. He spent years in silence, waiting on God's timing. He could have spoken out in anger or bitterness, but he chose to trust God's plan. That silence cultivated patience and endurance that ultimately led to his rise as a leader who saved many lives. Joseph's story reminds us that silence during waiting periods is not wasted time. It's preparation for purpose. Silence also helps you develop spiritual endurance because it trains you to rely on God's strength rather than your own. When you speak less and listen more, you begin to hear God's voice more clearly. You receive his encouragement, his wisdom, and his peace. That spiritual nourishment strengthens your soul to endure challenges and setbacks without losing hope. You're not just waiting, you're growing stronger as you wait. Patience cultivated in silence also impacts your relationships. When you resist the urge to speak harsh words in moments of frustration or hurt, you create space for healing. You allow God to work in both your heart and the hearts of others. Your silence becomes a balm, not a weapon. It fosters understanding instead of conflict. It builds bridges instead of walls. This kind of patience is a powerful testimony to the love and grace of God. We live in a culture that often equates silence with weakness or submission to injustice. But in God's kingdom, silence is a strategic act of strength. It's a way to show that you're not in a rush to fix things because you trust the one who already holds the outcome. Silence in the waiting seasons prepares you for the victory that's coming. It strengthens your faith to stand firm when the storms come. It deepens your reliance on God's grace and timing. When you practice silence to cultivate patience, you're also practicing hope. Hope is not just wishful thinking. It's confident expectation rooted in God's promises. Silence quiets the noise of doubt and fear so that hope can take root and grow. That hope sustains you through every delay, every setback, every unanswered question. It's the light that keeps you moving forward even when the way is unclear. The spiritual endurance you gain through silent patience equips you to face life's challenges with grace. It gives you the strength to persevere when others give up. It empowers you to keep believing when the situation looks impossible. And it readies you to receive God's blessings when they arrive. Because patience teaches you to wait with an open heart, not a clenched fist. So if you find yourself struggling with waiting, with silence, with the unknown, remember this: your silence is cultivating patience and strengthening your spiritual endurance. You're not wasting time, you're preparing for breakthrough. You're not powerless, you're building power. You're not forgotten, you're being formed. Trust the process. Trust God's timing. Trust that your silence is shaping a stronger, more faithful you.